this afternoon if you're in Singapore, or this morning if you're with our wonderful speakers in Europe. This afternoon's webinar, which is exploring the terrorist threats that we see in France in particular. And we've entitled the event, Terrorism and Extremism in Europe, the Heart of the European Threat, France's Terrorist Problems. Now, this is part of a series that we've been running at ICPVTR in RSIS for the past few months. Earlier sessions that we ran last year were looking at Germany and the United Kingdom. And the idea was to try to explore broadly what it was that terrorism threats look like at the moment in a European context. Europe is a place which has suffered from terrorism for some time. And we thought it was a good moment to sort of reevaluate where things were and what the threat picture actually looked like and where it was going. We are, of course, 20 years since 9/11, which kind of completely shook up the international terrorist threat picture. And this felt like an interesting set of questions to dig into. I'm delighted today that we're focusing finally on France. As I said, earlier sessions looked at Germany and looked at the UK, and we covered a number of different threats and aspects of the threats there. But I think France is particularly important within this context. Of course, in the European context, France is always very important, but I think from a terrorist perspective, what we've seen happen in France over the past few years is really very interesting, and in some ways captures a kind of broader threat picture that we've seen articulated globally when we're thinking about the kind of international terrorist threat picture that we're looking at. And that's why I'm delighted today that we're able to be joined by two really excellent French speakers, Laurence Bindner, who is a co-founder of the JOS Project, a platform of extremist and terrorist propaganda analysis, who has written and published widely for various French and international publications. You may have seen her publications as part of GNet, as part of the UN CTED Global Research Network, or as part of ICCT, or under some prominent French institutions like Xray, the French Institute for International Relations. And she's joining us to talk a bit about the threat picture from the kind of wider range of threats that France faces. And we're also delighted to be joined by Dr. Marc, who is Director of Research and Communications at the French Institute for International Relations, Xray. He's also the Editor-in-Chief of Politique Étrangère and a Research Fellow at the Security Studies Center. He also wrote a book in French, unfortunately, but we're hoping someone will step forwards and translate it, which was just published last year, looking at La Guerre de 20 ans, which is basically a look back at the kind of international global war on terrorism that we've seen play out over the past 20 years. He's also recently published a paper which was called Once a Jihadist, Always a Jihadist, which is an evaluation of the French disengagement program. And I think some of my wonderful colleagues at ICPVTR are going to share the link with you now in the chat function. And I'd encourage you to read it and share it widely. This is something, of course, which is a big focus of attention around the world to try to understand how we're going to actually get some of these radicalized individuals off the extremist path that they're on. So with these two wonderful speakers joining us, the plan for today's session is that I will moderate a discussion between the two of them, well, a discussion between me and the two of them for probably about half hour, 40 minutes. In the meantime, I would encourage people who are on the call to please put your questions in the chat function, and I will weave them into the conversation, and we will sort of go forwards there to cover the wide range of issues that we have on the table in front of us. So without further ado, let me turn it over to our wonderful speakers. And I'll start maybe with a slightly broader question, which I'll direct at Marc, which is, Marc, I mean, you know, you're someone who's just written a book, which is sort of an evaluation of the terrorist threat picture that we've seen in France over the past 20 years. But I wonder if you could put that into a kind of longer term context. You know, I think, I'm not sure that people necessarily remember, but of course, France is one of the countries which suffered earliest in Europe from violent Islamist terrorist problems, as well as a range of other threats that we've seen sort of over the years. So I wonder if you could get us going by putting us in the context of the kind of the wider French threat picture and how it kind of echoes in particular on the kind of violent Islamist side that we see today. Marc, over to you.
Well, thank you, Raffaello, for your very kind introduction, and I'd like to thank also the RSIS team for organizing this event. It's actually a very topical date, the 11th of January, because you may remember that, but in 2015, we had a very important wave of attacks that started in January on the 7th with the attack on Charlie Hebdo. And then on the next days, we also had a couple of other attacks, one on a policewoman and the other one on a Jewish grocery store. And then on January 11th, there were huge demonstrations in France, actually the biggest demonstration in the modern history of the country, with 4 million people in the streets, including almost 2 million in the streets of Paris. And of course, the purpose of these demonstrations was to reject terrorism and to show how the French population was attached to freedom of expression, freedom of religion, etc. And by the way, you mentioned my book, La Guerre de 20 ans, that was co-authored with my colleague Eddie Tenenbaum, and it was partly funded by an endowment called the January 11th Endowment, whose purpose is to perpetuate the so-called Esprit du 11 janvier, the spirit of January 11th. And so I guess that this seminar on January 11th is a good way to perpetuate this spirit. So thank you for organizing it, especially on this day. So now with regards to your question, it's true that France has a long history in dealing with terrorism, and I have to keep it short now, so I won't detail this history, but just remind you that the word terrorism actually comes from the French terror that took place during the revolution, so in 1792 or 93, in the 18th century. Then 1 century later, France had to face the anarchist threat with prominent politicians and civil servants who were killed by anarchists at the time. And if you then come back closer to us, there was, of course, terrorism linked to the Second World War, to the decolonization, to the War of Independence in Algeria. And then if you get even closer to us, let's say the 80s, we've had various kinds of terrorism in France, most prominently from the far left with a group called Action Directe, and also from regionalist separatist groups as the Corsican FLNC or the Basque ETA. We've also had threats emanating from the far right, especially in the 17th. There was a group called the Charmaltel group that perpetrated a few attacks in the country. So you see a very varied threat with especially internal threat emanating from various groups in France. But we've also been confronted to international terrorism starting in the 1980s, especially coming from the Middle East. So there were a few attacks emanating from Palestinian groups in France that targeted foreign interests. And at the time, actually, France had a very strange posture with regards to this threat. It was called the sanctuary doctrine. And basically, it meant that these terrorist groups were free to operate in the country as long as they did not target French interests. And this doctrine was progressively abandoned for several reasons. First, it created tensions with allies, such as Spain in the case of ETA, or Israel and the US in the case of Middle Eastern groups. Second, this doctrine was a sign of weakness and showed the inability of French authorities to deal with the issue of terrorism. And third, and most importantly, the sanctuary doctrine actually failed to immunize France against international terrorism. And especially the so-called Copernic bombing in 1980 that targeted a synagogue in Paris was a turning point. Palestinian groups had already perpetrated attacks on the French soil targeting Israeli interests. But with this attack, they targeted the French Jewish community. And they also, by the way, killed non-Jewish French citizens on this occasion. And it was obviously a turning point, and the French decided progressively to bury this sanctuary doctrine. And it was definitively buried in 1986 after a wave of attacks emanating from the Hezbollah and Iranian-linked groups in Paris. So you see, there was really a very mixed picture and a very varied threat till the 1980s. And then in the 1990s, there was the spillover of the Algerian civil war. And it was perhaps the first time that France was confronted to Sunni Islamist terrorism. And then, of course, after 9/11, it became the most prominent threat, but the French intelligence agencies managed to foil several attempts in the decade after 9/11, and France was finally targeted in 2012 in Toulouse and Montauban by Mohamed Merah. And I remind you that the targets of these attacks were, on the one hand, military people, the French military being involved at the time in Afghanistan, and also a Jewish school that was targeted by Mohamed Merah. And then later, of course, we've had this huge wave of attacks that started in 2015, but I perhaps detail it later on.
Thank you very much for that, Marc. I think you said it in a very wide context there. I think looking back at a threat, which, as you point out, the very word terrorism comes from a sort of French starting point. I wonder if I could turn to Laurence, because I think one of the interesting things in some ways that comes out of what Marc was saying was how, the side of the threat, which he didn't mention much about, was the right-wing threat. Which I think has started to sort of emerge recently. And I wonder if you could maybe touch a little bit on that and place that within the context of the kind of broader picture that Marc was talking about, or maybe even the broader European picture.
Thank you, Raffaello. Thank you very much for your invitation. I'm very glad to be here today. So, so regarding the ex-right wing, and as an introduction and to frame the perimeter, my comments today will refer to the violent fringe of the far right. So we are talking about groups and individuals at the far right that encourage terrorism, violent actions, and that do not accept the political game. So for that category, according to the French authorities, we have currently around 3,000 radicalized individuals, with around 500 of them at the highest part of the spectrum, meaning that they are really ready for violent action. So currently, the scope of this movement is really not as large as jihadism, but in the recent years, in the recent months, it's getting more and more structured, it's getting more and more organized. And with very specific characteristics. First, contrary to the jihadist landscape that is structured around three large spheres, ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and more localized groups such as HTS, the violent ex-right wing is very fragmented. It's very atomized. We have traditional segments such as neo-Nazis, identitarians, hooligans, etc. And in addition, since recently, we have new segments which have emerged and which have expanded in the recent period. We have survivalists, preparationists, people that are getting ready to survive in rough conditions after a natural or a political catastrophe. We have accelerationists, people who want to hasten the destruction of the society by a violent insurrection, racial conflict, etc. And we have more small movements such as ecofascism, such as botanism, satanism, etc. And among these new trends, and this is very visible in France, we have groups that recently went into hiding under the radar, that communicate with encrypted messengers and with a lot of operational security. And we have people that have started to arm themselves. And we have reached recently an unmatched level of preparedness. We can maybe later provide a few examples of cells that were discovered or plots that were foiled recently. Among this movement, we have, and this is very specific, contrary to jihadism, a large range of age, with extremely young individuals. So sometimes teenagers, that are in contact with X-right-wing propaganda or that themselves administrate X-right-wing forum. And also at the other end of the spectrum, we have people in their 50s, in their 60s, that are also involved in plots. And so the question is, why did this movement grow so much? I would mention few reasons, apart from classical socio-economical issues that regularly feed extremism. Since the recent years, we have had first the migrant crisis of 2015. We have had in Europe, and especially in France, the wave of jihadist attacks since 2014 that fed for some individuals the necessity to respond, to organize, to avenge, that also fed the ideas that the authorities were too weak. We have had also an inspiration coming from abroad. What happened in other countries with X-right-wing terror attacks also had mimetic consequences in France. We had about 10 years ago, we had Breivik in Norway, but more recently we had Brenton Tarrant in Christchurch in 2019. We had few attacks in Germany. We had few attacks in the United States, where the X-right-wing threat is now the #1 threat according to the US authorities. And all this, of course, is very inspirational for X-right-wing individuals and propagandists in France. And I would say that there is also two other important drivers. This fear, this movement is boosted recently by a very significant, very important wave of conspirationism. And this is especially true since the start of the pandemic. And we can observe actually many overlaps between X-right-wing online ecosystem and conspirationist ecosystem. And both online and in the real life. And it's a growing concern for the authorities that fear the aggregation, the coalition of many anti-system grievances into a broader movement, anti-system movement that could fuel more violence. And by the way, we have also seen some example of slippery slopes between conspiracy theories and real terrorism. But more broadly, there is sort of convergence between these two spheres. And lastly, what I wanted to mention is two more important drivers of the growth and the structuration of the X-right-wing sphere. First, it's the massive use of the internet and social media. X-right-wing ideologists have perfectly understood the interest to be present on the internet, to spread the ideology. It allows followers to be confronted to the ideology, to graphic violence with mimetic effects. There was actually an interesting survey by MI5 3 years ago that showed that the use of an extremist avatar online might familiarize yourself with a more radical personality. So using radical avatars may indeed have a radicalizing effect. And the second and last, but not least important element, I think, is the enlargement of the Overton windows, the acceptability window. We have seen very graphic propaganda from from the jihadist sphere that have sort of used the fabric to graphic violence. We have seen also violent rhetoric and some taboos also have been lifted and have played a sort of role of a stepping stone towards more radical engagement in the far right. So I would say that all these reasons that I try to synthesize a little bit contribute to this important and structuration since, let's say, in France, 2015, 2016, but it's accelerating actually.
That's fascinating, Laurence. And I think, you know, what you touched on there were a lot of points which in some way echoed, I think, what we heard from some of our last speakers, in particular during our German discussion, where I think some of the aspects you were talking about touched upon, which I think speaks to how this problem of the extreme right is quite pan-European. So I think, but it'd be interesting, and maybe as we go on a bit more, to unpack a little bit more the specificities to France. But I wonder if I could turn back to you, Marc, and pick up in some ways where you stopped your comments there. Because what Laurence just characterized was kind of a threat picture from the extreme right that's responded in some ways to the violent Islamist threat that we've seen in France. And I think what's fascinating and worrying in some ways about the threat in France is that it's gone from, you know, as you described in 2015, the attacks against Charlie Hebdo at the beginning of the year, and then of course the Bataclan attack, well, the much wider attack than just the Bataclan, but the attack on Paris in November that year, to what we've seen today, whereas we see these almost regular, you know, events of lone actor Islamists showing up. And I wonder if you could talk us through that evolution that you've seen. And in some ways, maybe that'll help us mirror a little bit what we just heard from Laurence on the extreme right.
Sure, I'll do that, but I just want to make one comment on what Laurence said, because you mentioned when you asked the question to Laurence that this threat was pretty recent. Actually, just one interesting fact, you know, there's currently the trial of the November 13th attack in France. It's a very long trial due to last 9 months. But during the trial, actually, there was another one. There were actually several other trials, but there was one that I want to mention. It was linked to the far right, actually. It was a plot that was foiled in 2017. And the name of the group is interesting. It's called OAS. And OAS is an acronym, and it's actually a reference, an obvious reference to the secret armed organization that was active during the War of Independence in Algeria, so in the 50s and early 60s. And so you see that it's not that recent. Of course, there's no operational link between the former OAS and the new one, but it's an intellectual reference, and it shows that actually there are intellectual roots, if you want, in the past. And this far-right threat is not that recent in terms of ideology. It's true that it recently emerged as a terrorist threat, or re-emerged as a terrorist threat, but it does not, you know, come out of the blue. There's a history in France also on this side. Now, to answer your question on jihadism, so in 2014 first, there was a terrorist attack perpetrated in Europe by a French citizen. That was the first terrorist attack perpetrated by a returnee. It was Mehdi Nemouche attack on the Jewish Museum in Brussels. And then France was targeted in January 2015. These attacks in January 2015 are pretty interesting because it's one of the rare occasions where you see a cooperation between terrorists who claim themselves to belong to Al-Qaeda on the one hand and ISIS on the other. So the Kouachi brothers who perpetrated the Charlie Hebdo attack actually trained or were linked to, it's still a bit controversial, but they were linked to Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. Whereas Amedi Koulibaly, who killed the policewoman and perpetrated the attack in the Jewish grocery store, took credit for ISIS. So it doesn't mean, of course, that ISIS and Al-Qaeda Central coordinated these attacks, but it means that underground in France, these terrorists knew each other and actually coordinated themselves in a way. Then there were a series of attacks in the spring and summer of 2015, and that's quite interesting because at the time they were already perpetrated by lone actors, or at least they were perceived to be perpetrated by lone actors, and we didn't know that some of these attacks were actually coordinated from Syria. by about the same guy was behind the November 13th attack. So actually that was very interesting, because I remember really well that in September and October 2015, one of the main questions for the counter-terrorist community was how to counter small cells or so-called lone wolves, even though we know they are not really lone wolves, let's say lone actors. And actually this series of lone actors attacks can be perceived now with hindsight as a kind of smokescreen that masked the broader plot that was developing and that led to the November 13th attacks that are by far the most lethal attacks that we've had recently in France. And then we've had a series of other attacks in 2016 with an evolution already at the time. We slightly moved from exported terrorism, with commandos being trained in Syria and sent back to Europe. That's what happened so in Paris on November 13th, but also in Brussels in March 2016. So we moved from this modus operandi to remotely controlled terrorism through encrypted apps. And we've had one very famous case in France of one specific terrorist who was based in Syria and who used Telegram to try and radicalize remotely individuals who tried to perpetrate several attacks and who actually did perpetrate attacks. For instance, you may remember, but a priest was beheaded at some point in France in 2016. And actually, the two guys who perpetrated this attack were linked to this terrorist in Syria. And then there was again an evolution, because of course the counterterrorism side was really active in France, but also in Iraq and Syria. France was involved militarily in the global coalition to counter ISIS in Iraq and then in Syria. For instance, this terrorist was targeted and killed. I think it was I don't remember if it was in 2016 or 2017, but then this the threat again evolved, and we moved slightly towards what you described, Raffaello, that is to say lone actors that are radicalized, especially online, and who perpetrate attacks without being linked operationally to an organization abroad. But if you've had asked me to describe the whole gamut of jihadist threat in France, let's say early 2017, I would have said basically that there were four threats. The first one was linked to ISIS and the possibility of commandos being sent back to Europe. So that's what happened in November 2015. Then the second one was the reactivation of previous jihadist network. Typically, jihadists who belonged to Al-Qaeda in 2004, 2005 during the war in Iraq, who then spent some time in jail in France because they tried to go to Iraq or because they went there and come back, and then were released and perhaps were re-radicalized or were re-engaged in jihadi groups. And Sherif Kouachi, actually one of the killers of Charlie Hebdo, is a very good example of that, because he tried to go to Iraq in 2004. He was arrested on the eve of his departure, sent to jail, then released, and 10 years after he perpetrated the Charlie Hebdo attack. So that's a very obvious case of terrorist recidivism. Then the third threat would be online radicalization and the lone actor threat. And the fourth threat would be what the French intelligence agency at the time called oblique attack, that is to say attacks perpetrated in France, but by foreigners. And we've had several examples of that, people who took advantage of the freedom of movement within the Schengen area to move from one country to another, and in that case to attack France. And if you take the most recent attacks that we've had in France, they were linked actually to the two last kinds of threat that I mentioned, that is to say lone actors who in a way self-radicalize, even though it's perhaps not the good expression, and also foreigners who came to France to perpetrate attacks. For instance, the attack in Nice at the end of 2020 was perpetrated by a Tunisian citizen who had arrived in France just days before the attack.
Thank you for that, Marc. I'm wondering, if I could turn it back to Laurence, I think, because the threat picture that Marc just outlined, is kind of mirrored, as you said, what you were talking about on the extreme right side. And I wonder if we could now, if you could you touched on this briefly in your comments earlier, but it'd be really interesting to hear how the two kind of interplay with each other. Is there a degree to which we can see the sort of extreme right in France, responding to the Islamists, and then the Islamists conversely responding to the far right? And is that kind of a back and forth that you see playing out? And maybe, to sort of go a bit beyond that, but sticking on the ideological side, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how, kind of more broadly, some of the narratives against France that we see being articulated by groups. And I'm very conscious here that, we've asked you to start talking about the extreme right, but you're very well versed on the kind of jihadist threat and other threats in France as well. So, maybe if you want to talk about the sort of narratives more broadly against France in particular. And then I think after that, what we'll try to do is just to warn Marc, I think we'll switch to think a little bit about some of the response to understand a bit how France is kind of responding to some of these threats. But Laurence, over to you to talk a little bit about the kind of ideologies that we see.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, this is a very interesting point, because the right wing propaganda often depicts itself as a sort of antidote against jihadism or jihadist propaganda. And I would say, in fact, that the two propagandas, the two ideologies, have quite a few similarities. There are some similarities, there are some parallels. First, there are some parallels in terms of vision of the world, the project. On both sides, you see a utopian project, you see a totalitarian project, you see among individuals a search for purity, an obsession with purity. You also see rejection of the so-called deviances of the society. You see misogynic tropes, anti-Semitic tropes. On both sides glorify the past, have a nostalgia of the past, etc., etc. So there are many actually common elements among their worldview. And but not only that, there are also quite a few similarities in terms of grievances. Both sides, jihadist and right-wing individuals, are convinced that they are persecuted, that they are being threatened existentially, in an existential way. For instance, regarding France, jihadists firmly believe that France is attacking Islam in a religious capacity, with the law regarding laïcité, secularity, the French very specific laïcité, but also in a kinetic capacity with the various military interventions in Muslim countries, in Mali, in Syria and Iraq, in Afghanistan, etc. So there is Islam is perceived to be threatened. And from their end, right-wing individuals firmly believe that a white genocide is taking place, that there is a great replacement in the making, and that they are threatened in their identity. So once again, we see really a sort of complementarity, similarities in their grievances. Both sides position themselves at the vanguard. Both sides, jihadist and violent extractive movements, see themselves as those who are going to resist that threat, and for that, both glorify martyrs. On the one side, you have the caravan of the Shuhada on the jihadist side, the caravan of martyrs, and on the other side, you have the saint calendar on the right wing that advertise the action of of attackers who sacrifice for their cause. So we see a lot of parallel and a lot of similarities. But I would say that more operationally, what might be more surprising is that one side is feeding the other side, and there is a sort of symbiosis between both sides. First, we see some propaganda element on the one side embedded in the propaganda of the other side. In particular, graphic elements, with always the idea to say, look what they're doing to us. We have to react and we have to avenge that. And this phenomenon is not new. It has been taught before in a theoretical point of view, in particular by Zarqawi, the founder of the first ISIS iteration. One of the reasons why Zarqawi wanted to mediatize the exactions against the Shia population was in order to radicalize Shias so that they also carry out exactions against Sunnis in order to radicalize Sunnis and recruit them. So there is a really mechanism of mutual reciprocal radicalization here. So it's not new, and we clearly see it in action with the ex-right wing and jihadist propaganda, and it's very obvious actually online. What is also obvious online, and this is much more recent, I would say that we observe that since maybe 1 year, 1 or 2 years, there is a sort of convergence of codes. The ex-right wing uses the jihadist uses codes of ex-right wing, like memes and elements like that were totally absent from jihadist propaganda a few years ago. And on the other side, we see pictures of very well-known jihadists used by ex-right wing ideologists to show an admiration for jihadists who fight for their cause, who fight till death, etc. For sort of virilism, etc. And this sometimes leads to a very paradoxical situation, sort of pragmatic cooperation. They both sides have accelerationist trend. They both have an interest in the collapse of the society. It's accelerationism now. It's very pervasive in the ex-right wing, but it also has been used theoretically in jihadism to build an Islamic pure society, profit from the chaos to build an Islamic society. And regarding, I would say, tactical cooperation, there are some few examples that are really striking. 2 years ago, I think it was 2019, there was this case of US soldier called Ethan Metzler, who was the sympathizer of a Satanist group, and he wanted to generate a racial war. And so he contacted an Al-Qaeda operative to provide him with information regarding his army units in order that Al-Qaeda carries out an attack against this unit to start a sort of series of reciprocal attack. It turned out that the Al-Qaeda operative was in fact an FBI agent, so nothing happened, and Metzler was arrested. But beyond the intellectual interface, there is a real possible field for cooperation. And I would conclude that you asked me regarding the situation in France and the interplay specifically regarding France. I would say that in general, jihadists don't show any interest for politics. Nevertheless, we see in the jihadist sphere some comments, some discussions, and some remarks that are quite interesting and showing that for them, it would be a great opportunity that the far right has a high score in the next future presidential election in France, because of course it's going to generate fear among the Muslim population, and it's going to boost their recruitment. So there still here we see again a sort of mutual interest in weakening democratic institution and republican institution. They both have this interest on both sides.
Thank you for that, Laurence, and a fascinating point to end on there about how their comments, I think that echoed what you'd see in other places. I think if they see extremists rise to the top, they think it's good for us. It's going to help radicalize and polarize the environment, and that's always a propitious environment for extremist groups to operate and thinking. I also was quite struck by your comments about the mimetic elements, because I think that's a really interesting one that we've seen certainly in some Southeast Asian discourses as well, where you can see groups copying what they see groups in the West doing, and in a way not necessarily always doing that in a sort of ideologically coherent fashion. You know, so individuals who may be more inclined in a sort of Islamist direction, sort of emulating bits of the far right or some sort of right, you know, ideologies out here in Asia, copying what they see happening in parts of Europe or the United States. And that's kind of an interesting interplay, I think, that we see happening at a kind of global level. I want to switch it back to Marc now and turn the question a little bit to response, and how the French state has managed to respond to these problems over time. And I want to kind of pick up on two things. One is you made a brief comment in some of your earlier comments about how, you know, pre-Mohamed Merah's atrocity in Toulouse and Montauban, you know, France had been spared in some ways, well, had been spared from any sort of major attacks. There'd been a number of disruptive plots. You say, you know, French agencies were effective at sort of stopping the threat picture then. And then suddenly we have Merah, and then we have the war in Syria, and then we have everything that comes after that, where France really does become kind of the heart of the threat in Europe. So, you know, I wonder if you could, on the one hand, talk us through that and what you think changed in terms of the government capability, that suddenly the threat picture developed in a direction that was seemingly way beyond their control. And then secondly, I think it'd be great to hear, I mean, you've just published this paper, or you published last year, this paper, which I would encourage everyone to look at, looking at France's disengagement program. I wonder if you could talk us through France's disengagement program and how effective that is, and how much, you know, what lessons have been learned over time. I mean, here again, in Singapore in particular, this is really the core of the response, and there's a very substantial program which has been working quite effectively for many years. You know, so it'd be really interesting to hear a bit more about how that disengagement program actually works. So over to you, sort of a response, if I put it in British parlance terms, on the pursue and the prevent side, how has the French response gone?
Okay, thank you. If I may, I just want to say a couple of words on the threat, and then I'll shift to the response, because I measured that I didn't give you any magnitude of the threat, and so it's important to say that. So just a few figures. During the presidency of François Hollande, so the previous president, from 2012 to 2017, so that's when we've had this huge wave of attacks in 2015, 2016, we've had 240 persons killed in terrorist attacks in France. And since Emmanuel Macron was elected in 2017, the threat is still very high, but the attacks are much less lethal. So we've turned to low cost and low tech attacks that kill few people. So we've had 24 persons killed. So you see, it's from 240 to 24. So there's really a threat that is much less lethal today, even though it's still pregnant. It's still prominent, and there are still plots and attacks on a quite regular basis. And I'd like to say also that there's been an ideological broadening of the threat. So it's no longer necessarily linked to ISIS or Al-Qaeda. And what we've noticed at the end of 2020, especially when we've had a wave of small-scale attacks, including the beheading of Samuel Paty, and including also an attack in front of the former offices of Charlie Hebdo, is that some of these attacks were really not linked to Al-Qaeda or ISIS, but were perpetrated by individuals who felt shocked by blasphemy, by the caricatures, and who decided actually to perpetrate a terrorist attack in order to avenge the prophet. So one interesting example is this attack that I just mentioned in front of the former offices of Charlie Hebdo. It was perpetrated by a Pakistani citizen who took credit for the attack in the name of a Barelvi Pakistani extremist group. And that was really surprising, actually, in the context of France. And I think that we should perhaps be much more cautious and precise in the evaluation of this ideological shift, because there's something, probably an interesting evolution that we should catch and grasp intellectually and also operationally. One last figure: we currently have around 8,000 Islamists or jihadists in the French on the French watch list. So people who are actively monitored by the police or the domestic intelligence agency. Now, I turn to the response. So historically, France has had a judicial and police-oriented approach to fight terrorism. And I described the attacks at the beginning of the 1980s. One very important evolution in the 80s is the beginning of the centralization and the specialization approach of counterterrorism in France. It means that we created dedicated units within the Ministry of Interior and within the Ministry of Justice to deal with terrorism. Another very interesting evolution in the 1990s and linked to the spillover of the Algerian civil war to France is the creation of an incrimination, a judicial incrimination, that proved very useful to try and prevent terrorist attacks. And this incrimination actually allowed the judges to consider that a plot to perpetrate an attack was considered in itself as terrorism. So it's called Association de malfaiteurs terroristes in French, and it's a very broad incrimination that was created so in 1996, and that is still used today, and it's probably the most common incrimination that's used until this day in terrorist cases. Then after 9/11, there were very interesting evolutions. First, the French approach became more and more militarized. So the French armed forces were deployed to Afghanistan from 2001 to 2014. As you know, France refused to join the US in Iraq in 2003. And interestingly enough, the French used the armed forces to fight terrorism in Afghanistan, but there was a conceptualization that was different from the war on terror in the US. So we had a white book in 2006 published on the fight on terrorism, and it was written very clearly and very nuancedly that France used the military, but did not do it in the framework of a war on terrorism. So it's a bit subtle, but I think that it was a very actually clever way to put it. And it was also explained that if you enter this framework of the war on terror, there would be judicial consequences, and there may also be consequences on the national soil in terms of laws of exceptions, or even in terms of framing a kind of civil war. Because if you're moving to the framework of a war on terror and you actually have your own citizens that belong to jihadist groups, then you may perhaps slide towards this dangerous slope of a civil war. So this concept of war on terror was really rejected by the French authorities until actually 2013, and the deployment of French troops in the Sahel region in the framework of an operation called Serval that later turned into a broader operation called Barkhane. And then the concept of war on terrorism was used actually by the Minister of Defense at the time. And after the attacks in 2015 on French soil, this concept of war on terrorism was even used by the Prime Minister and the President. So here you can see that when you face a very burning threat, you may have a very important and noticeable evolution in the approach of the fight on terrorism, and you may even wonder if it's not an overreaction to the threat. Another interesting evolution that I have to mention during this most recent period, so since 2015, is the accumulation of laws to try and fight terrorism. And during a very limited period of time, that is to say between 2015 and 2017, we even had a state of emergency that allowed for a kind of extra judicial actions by the Ministry of Interior. And on the other hand, we also had an interesting evolution with a broadening of the spectrum of the fight on terrorism, against terrorism, on the softer approach. That is to say that France also developed programs to prevent radicalization and also on the disengagement side. And we started that really lately, only in 2013, 2014, and then it really became much more active and effective after 2015. And in this framework, France developed this disengagement program that you mentioned, Raffaello, and that I was appointed to assess. And actually, it will not surprise you here in Singapore, because I think that there's an international convergence on these issues. So that is to say, the French program is divided into three pillars: social pillar to help these individuals who are released from jail to reintegrate into the society, to find a job, to find housing, etc. There's a psychological pillar because some of them suffer from psychological troubles or even from psychiatric illnesses, even if it's a very small minority who suffer from these illnesses. And there's an ideological pillar, that's the third pillar, and that's led by either imam or specialists of Islam who try to explain these former inmates that ISIS and Al-Qaeda are a very extremist version of their religion, and that they should opt for a more moderate approach. And just to give you one last figure, in France, there were approximately a bit more than 500 terrorist inmates on the jihadist side by the end of 2020. And by the end of 2021, there were approximately 450. So you see that there were more than 50 individuals who were released during this year. And so that's why it's very important to develop these disengagement programs for prisoners who are released from jail.
Thank you for that, Marc. And it's great to hear that you were working so intimately on this particular project. And I think you're right. The structure that you talked about mirrors what we see in lots of other places. I'm going to start trying to feed in some of the questions that we started getting. We got a couple of questions already, so I'll start to bring them in. But let me encourage the audience, if you do have any questions you want to put to our speakers, please feel free to put them into the chat box, and I'll then bring them in and put them to both of them or to whichever of them feels most appropriate. I see that there's one question there now, but before I touch on that, and just to give people a moment to feed in some other questions, I want to put something kind of briefly to Laurence, maybe, and then before we go into the question and answer session. In some ways, the numbers that Marc talked about in terms of the threat size, 240 casualties to 24, that's a reduction of, down to 10%, frankly. And, I don't know how many attacks that's actually talking about in each of the two contexts. I would guess that it's more in the 24, as in more individual incidents, than in the 240, which I think might be a few incidents that cause many, many more casualties. But I think that this does reflect a kind of general downward trend, dare I say it. which is something that we've just seen here at RSIS in Singapore. We publish annually our counter-terrorism trends and analysis journal puts out an annual report. And one of the big takeaways from last year's report, which just went out earlier this month, was that over the past year, there is kind of a downward trend in the sort of terrorist violence there. And, you know, I'm wondering if you could sort of frame this a bit for us, Laurence, you know, because if I look back at some Europol reporting, Europol reporting seems to indicate this as well. You know, it says there's a lot more lone actor attacks, but broadly the terrorist threat does seem to be in a kind of downward trajectory. Do you recognize that? Because at the same time, the kind of threat picture ideologically you talked about sounded very vibrant. You know, lots of groups kind of talking to each other, new groups emerging, ideologies developing, a kind of online space that was really driving a lot forwards. I wonder if you could talk us through, you know, how we should understand this in a French context in particular. Is the threat one that you think is kind of generally going down, violence is decreasing and threats are getting less bad, or is something else happening and we're just kind of seeing a lull before something comes back? I wonder if you could talk us through that a little bit. And then I see some questions starting to come in, so I'll then start to turn to some of those and put them to both of you. But Laurence, if you have a few minutes on that, please.
Yeah, well, on the Xray wing side, lone actors have been the standard, have been the norma. I'm thinking of Breivik in Norway, 2011, Tarrant in Christchurch, Bors in Pittsburgh, Ernest in Poway in the United States. These guys have acted alone, and actually it was not just one or two dead people, but it's also important figures. The lone actor action have been on the X-right wing also theorized by Louis Beam, a KKK member about 30 years ago in a book called Leaderless Resistance, where he explained that acting alone will give you a less chance to be arrested and your terror attack to get forward. I would say that broadly speaking, there are more now free elections, if I may say, free elections between the various movements than it was a few years ago. Marc really summarized it very well with the three or four terror attacks of last year in France. The three terror attacks that took place in autumn. Paty, former office of Charlie Hebdo, and the Nice attack, but also there was a terror attack later in 2021 against a policewoman in Rambouillet, and the perpetrator of this attack didn't pay allegiance to a jihadist group, and there was no claim by any jihadist group regarding this terror attack. So he was kind of detached of this jihadist group, and this is yes, this is I would say that this is a new phenomenon regarding jihadism, that you can see terror attacks in the name of Islamist ideology, but that are not attached with any group. Regarding the X-right wing, it's as we have mentioned before, it's much more fragmented. So naturally, individuals are more few free electrons, and I would say that the evolution recently, and we have seen this in the United States, in the UK, and in France. I mean, it was acknowledged by the authorities in these three countries, but it's very true in France. We see a sort of new category of people. So in France, the authorities called that a fourre-tout, and in the UK, it was called the mixed, unclear, and uncertain profiles, MUU, I think. meaning that we know that these profiles are dangerous, but once they take action, once they take violent actions, it's hard to know precisely what the ideological driver is behind. And we see people that among the various ex-right-wing subsegments, we see people that are going from neo-Nazi to accelerationism to eco-fascism before settling on one ideology that fits them better, and before they may take violent action. I think that also one element that we see in ex-right wing is that there are lots of talking, there are lots of boasting. We are going to destroy the society. We're going to do this. We're going to do that. There are lots of boasting, and few people are actually taking violent actions. But what the authorities are fearing is that individual, maybe more fragile individuals or more angry individuals, show some wariness of this preparation phase and arm themselves and take actions. And we have seen several, I mean, in the ex-right-wing side, there have been around six foiled plots on 36 foiled plots since 2017, which is not a lot, but it's accelerating. Among these six, not all of them were lone actors, far from that. But very recently, there have been some arrests showing, for instance, there was this guy who was arrested in August in Eastern France, 26 years old, and he was building dirty bombs with uranium-based handmade dirty bombs, and three of the four bombs were actually ready to action. And he was quite alone. So of course, lone wolf is something that is now quite difficult to use because they are in a sphere, in an ecosystem, whether online or in the real life. But this guy were acting alone, and it shows actually the level of preparedness that one can achieve alone.
Thank you. Yes, I remember that case. It was quite a striking one. The guy had bought, I think, uranium powder or some such off eBay, yes, or something like that, which is pretty, which I guess means eBay has to answer some questions as well. But I'll start to pick up on some of the questions and comments that have started to come in, and I'm going to start with two from some of my excellent RSS colleagues who put them in and put their names as well, which means I notice who it is. First is a colleague from a comment from a colleague, Shashi Jayakumar, who runs one of the centers at RSS, who says that he noticed a couple of similarities between France and Singapore on the kind of response side that you were talking about, and the aspects of the psychological and religious counseling key to the Singaporean approach for detainees. The third pillar, and this is, I think, where maybe there's a question kind of within this, is, you know, and if this is the same for the French approach, is aftercare, which is ensuring the resocialization of the individuals back into society at the end, and trying slowly to get that away from the kind of securitized aspect that they were maybe first drawn into. So I don't know if you have any sort of responses or reflections on that. I guess the question is, how much is aftercare the focus of the French program, or is it just individuals go through the program and then at the end of it they're sort of, you know, given a diploma and said, all right, well, have a nice day? I mean, how much does, you know, the kind of aftercare and engagement with the individuals carry forwards? I mean, here in Singapore, for example, I know it goes on for years. You know, you sort of get announcements in the papers, so-and-so has finally had his detention order removed or restriction order taken off, and that can be years after they were sort of presumptively released in the program. So I wonder if you have any thoughts on that, and then I'll turn to some of the other questions.
Okay. I'll answer this question, but just also one reaction on what was said before, and especially on this tenfold decrease that you mentioned, Raf, between the 240 casualties to the 24. I think that one decisive explanation is, of course, the end of ISIS safe haven in Syria and Iraq. And here we see, obviously, that when a terrorist group has a safe haven where terrorists can be trained and then sent back to Europe, you have a much higher threat than when this safe haven destroyed. So the question right now is whether we are experiencing a transition towards something else, and what could be the next safe haven. Of course, Afghanistan is worrying. Of course, the Sahel region is worrying as well, and the French armed forces have been particularly active in this region, but so far the threat has been confined to the region, and they did not manage to send fighters and terrorists to Europe. But I guess that one of the key questions for the future is whether there will be another safe haven or not. And I think that we can even say that the closer the safe haven, the higher the threat. And then to answer the question of your colleague, yes, resocialization is also a key aspect in France. So the program can last for a few years, actually, and as long as the person is under judicial monitoring, the program can last. But this program is not dedicated to all the jihadists released from jail, because there are simply too many jihadists released from jail. And another explanation is that some of them actually do not need the program once they are released, either because they are already de-radicalized, if I can use this term, or because they are still, too much radicalized, and so the program will just be ineffective with this kind of individuals. So the program is really dedicated to the individuals who are perceived as being, if I may use this expression, radicalized enough to fit in the program so that it can be effective. And yes, the social pillar, so resocialization is very important, but I'd say that it's perhaps not the right way to put it, but I'd say it that way. It's perhaps the easiest pillar in the way that you can measure the result. If someone finds a job, then you can tick the box. If someone finds a flat, you can also tick the box. But actually, it doesn't tell you much about the de-radicalization. So I'd say that the ideological pillar and the psychological pillars are as important as the social one, but it's much harder to evaluate the results.
Thank you for that. And, to those who put their questions in, forgive me if I jump around a bit between them, and I'm trying to sort of keep them onto themes. And within that, I see that a question has just been put in, which asks specifically about the extreme right. And I wonder if I could put this to you, Laurence, is, had there been any similar programs of looking at de-radicalization focused on the extreme right-wing threat in France, or are they just treated in the same way, in the same form of program that that Marc was describing?
Not that I know of, unless Marc tells other way, because he's the expert on that. But I don't even think that ex-right-wing individuals go through the same programs as radical Islamists. As far as I know, there is nothing that has been put in place, but it's not so surprising, even if we have had, as Marc reminded, roots of ex-right-wing roots since a few decades to a long time in France. The wave is growing now, and we still don't have the hindsight to put on programs, but maybe it's something that is in the pipe. I don't know, but it's the magnitude is not the magnitude of jihadist individuals that are currently in jail.
If I may add one little comment on that, France was actually quite criticized in 2015 when it developed its official counter-narrative program called Stop Jihadism, because of the name, because it was solely focused on jihadism and not on other kinds of threats and ideologies. And Laurence is right. I mean, there's currently no disengagement program for the far right in France. And I think that it just reflects the priorities of the governments given the magnitude of the jihadist threat over the past years. But it's true as well that we're seeing a rise of the far right. And so as far as I know, the disengagement program for the far right are not on the pipe, but they probably should be because it's a growing threat.
Please, Laurence, go ahead.
If I may add something, actually, I was thinking of programs such as what Marc described about jihadism. But in terms of counter speech, there is something that has been started maybe 1 year ago by an organism, a unity called ICPVTR, which is a communication unit from the government whose aim is to counter speech, to provide counter speech alternative narratives to radicalization. And this ICPVTR has also started to publish. So it's more focused on radical Islam, much more, but it has started a few months ago to focus on ex-right-wing separatism, on ex-right-wing drivers, on what fuels ex-right-wing, etc., etc. So we have seen few short videos on that topic. So it's not exactly true to say that this hasn't started. It has started, and of course, in terms of intelligence services, this threat is really taken into account, and more and more people are dedicated to the ex-right-wing threat, clearly.
Raf, if I may, Laurence just used the buzzword separatism. It's been the buzzword in France for more than a year now, and it's true that it includes part of the far right, but the focus really, when the government uses the word separatism, is more Islamists, and I say Islamists, not jihadists, because really what's been striking over the, let's say, past 18 months is a broadening of the approach of the government to tackle not only jihadism, but also Islamists who are perceived as subversive in the way that they use a rhetoric that divides the society and that can lead to violence as well. So we've had a law last year tackling specifically Islamism and trying to, if you want, broaden the spectrum of the fight that is not only focused on pure security issue, but also on societal issues as well.
Thank you. And actually, you've teed up there perfectly the next question I wanted to turn to, which is one by another one of our RSI scholars, in fact, the head of ICPVTR, Kumar Ramakrishna, who asked the question of, is there a problem of foreign religious preachers spreading Islamist extremist ideas amongst Muslim communities in France? And how is the government and civil society responding to that? And do you think, so I wonder if you could talk us through the evolution, which you just touched upon briefly there, that we've seen recently, this kind of expansion in some ways of the French response, and whether that's in response to an attempt to try to, take a wider approach to dealing with this and sort of going deep, further upstream, let's say, in the Islamist threat picture, or is it really because there are many more of these preachers going around, or many more extremist ideologues spreading Islamist ideas in particular?
I'd say that 15 years ago, the focus was really on these preachers, but laws were actually adopted to try and tackle these issues. So the radical mosques are really well identified by the domestic intelligence agencies, and there are actually judicial means to fight the radical speeches that are pronounced in these mosques, not only terrorist inciting speeches, but also more and more speeches that incite to separatism. So there was actually a reinforcement of this law last year, of the legal measures, if you want. So I'd say that the focus today is not that much on foreign preachers. We've regularly had over the past 20 or 15 years preachers expelled from France to the Maghreb region or even to the Gulf. The focus now is much more on the way this radical ideology spread on the internet and are used by sometimes vulnerable individuals, but also sometimes people that who are not that vulnerable to radicalize themselves. And it's perhaps much harder to grasp this threat when it's so decentralized. And it was easier actually when it was just limited to certain mosques that you could monitor and try and control.
Thank you. It's all part of the sort of diffusion of the threat that we see is getting so much more confusing. Now, we've had a whole lot of different questions and points in. So questioners, forgive me. I'm going to try to group some together now to try to put them to our speakers. So I apologize if I lose some nuance in there. But broadly, we've had a whole bunch of questions about ideology. And some that are kind of clustered on the looking at the right, and some that are clustered on the Islamist side. So one is I put the right-wing one to Laurence, but Laurence, if you have some thoughts on the Islamist one, do come back to that, and then I'll put the Islamist one to Marc. But again, and conversely. So because I'm conscious you're both very savvy on the broad range of issues in France. So if you do have some thoughts on the others, please feel free. But to start, maybe with the sort of right-wing side of the coin that we asked. So someone's asked a question about the degree to which race and racism drives the sort of extreme right in France in particular. And someone else asked a question about how much we see the extreme right in France, again, in particular, being driven by some of these wider, more online ideas we see emerging, like the sort of manosphere, QAnon, some of these anti-Semitic, anti-vax conspiracies that we've seen develop during COVID. How much are these driving the extreme right that we see in France in particular? And then a final sort of tweak to this one is someone's asked a question looking specifically at Génération Identitaire that claim not to be racist, but are simply expressing Frenchness and French values. And that's really quite a mainstream narrative, I think, in France as well, in the political discourse. So I wonder, Laurence, there's quite a big and broad and difficult question there that I'm conscious you touched on a bit at the beginning, but, I wonder if you could talk about sort of race, some of these new, more online ideas, and some of this question of Frenchness being something that, the right wing in France is claiming, or the extreme right in France is claiming, and how that might complicate a sort of response from the government. So if you could talk us through some of the ideology on the right there, and then I'll switch to the Islamist side with Marc, please.
Yeah, it's a large question. Well, first, regarding I think that QAnon is a good way to start to answer this question. QAnon is very specific to the United States. It refers to millenarist sects of the United States. It's very entrenched in US history. There have been some attempts of QAnon to reach Europe, in particular France and Germany. It has reached Germany, and the QAnon movement in Germany is quite important. We have seen demonstration at the end of 2020 with really people with Q-branded people. In France, QAnon narratives arrived in France through French-speaking Canadian French-speaking people that were, of course, closer to the US QAnon. And we have seen online quite an interesting QAnon ecosystem that was organized on some encrypted messaging application that was organized geographically. So you had QAnon Bretagne, you had QAnon Great East, you had QAnon whatever. It was very regionalized. It reached like something like 2,000 people, not more. But what I think is that these people were very interested in Trump elections. They were pro-Trump, etc., etc. And after Trump's defeat, they lost their momentum. But what's more interesting is that some narratives of the QAnon now are used by anti-system people, and especially the narratives around the children, children criminality, pedocriminality, etc., etc. And we see that narrative is very much used now by active anti-vax people that are really putting forward the narratives of we are using our children, we are killing our, there is a children genocide, etc., etc. So, so I would say that some of these movements, I think that QAnon is a meta conspiracy, and it always have it always can have a local application. I mean, a local avatar. The anti-elite narrative is also was also fed at all this QAnon movement, but it didn't really wasn't really entrenched in France. No, and you really barely see in demonstration in France people wearing Q posters or Q references. Regarding the specificity of the X-right wing ideology in France, I would say that you also find, I mean, the anti-Semitic conspiracy is, I think it's a worldwide thing that you find in every country, even if there are no Jews. It's of course here since decades. I would say that, and this is answering also one other question, is this fueled by racism? Yes, of course, racism is one of the fuel of the X-right wing. And what is currently happening is that recently some taboos have been lifted. And I would say it's both bottom up and top down. It's bottom up because we see racist, xenophobic, anti-Semitic narratives that have grown online in a significant way, and these narratives are also sometimes used by politicians that are, I mean, not so clearly and not in a sort of really hateful way, but in a sort of suggestive way that is feeding all that. Hope this synthesizes the answer. Regarding génération identitaire, génération identitaire is at the crossroad between the extreme right and the more violent far right. It's not a terrorist group, and génération identitaire has been dissolved few months ago by the government. It has been dissolved because it organized actions against mosques, actions in the Alps against immigrants that were illegal. And of course, their action online is participating in the opening of this Overton window. And also we have seen links between Génération Identitaire and so more extremist personalities. And so all this is a continuum. It's very difficult to actually put a boundary between what is really violent and what is really ideological. And we have seen reports that regarding Génération Identitaire making Nazi signs, etc., etc. So once again, it's quite difficult to draw the line between what is really violent and what is only ideologic. And like regarding radical Islam, ideology is also fueling, it's also a stepping stone towards more violent action. So the government in dissolving Génération Identitaire, but not only this one, there was Alvarium belonging to Ex-Bastion Social, which is a more violent ex-right-wing movement that was dissolved. The government is taking all that in consideration, learning with the lessons of radical Islam. You have some ideologies that are fueling narratives that are pushing people towards more radical ideas and violence. So I think that Génération Identitaire positioning goes beyond Frenchness and fuel a more radical narrative. And this is the reason why they were dissolved.
Just one comment on that, Raffaello, if I may. the dissolution, as Laurence mentioned, Génération Identitaire and other groups were dissolved, either on the far right or Islamist groups as well. And I think it shows the limits of what the government can do. You can act on the structure, but it actually has no effect on the ideology when you do that. So in a way, it's not by breaking down the thermometer that you bring down the fever. So it's an expression in French. I don't know if it makes sense in English, but you understand, I guess.
But we don't. The translation doesn't work perfectly, but it's very clear what you're driving towards. I want to, I'm conscious we're coming towards the end now. We've got about 5 minutes or so left. But I maybe want to switch back and pick up on, as I said, on some of the Islamist ideological questions that were raised. And we had a couple of questions asked. One was asked looking at the degree to which, the threat picture in France, and the broader situation in the Middle East, in particular what we see continue to happen in Palestine, French involvement, of course, you mentioned in Mali, which I think actually French involvement scaled back there because of some problems with the government on the ground. But, France is still a very active country in sort of military terms around the Arab world. And this was always a kind of classic driver of, threats and grievance. And then the other one, which one of my other wonderful colleagues at RSS touched on, which is the question of, when we look back at, the early narratives around radicalization in France, the discussion was about the infamous banlieue, and the kind of ghettoization and communities that exist there who are sort of, alienated, disenfranchised, young, second, third generation youth who, for socioeconomic reasons were being, attracted to these ideas. Now, I know there's some question around how much that was totally true all the time or not, but I wonder if you could talk about these two kind of ideas and how much these still drive the kind of violent Islamist ideology or problems or groups that we see in France in particular. And then, if you sort of can wrap within that any final points that you wanted to make to the audience as well, I'll then give Laurence a very brief opportunity if you had anything you wanted to add after that, and then I'll wrap up. And that means we'll probably go a little bit over time, but forgive me everyone in advance. I do try to keep these things to schedule. But Marc, over to you, please, first. I'm afraid you're on mute, Marc.
Sorry. It so happens that my PhD dissertation that I defended more than 10 years ago was about the so-called import of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in France, to France. So it's actually online, but it's in French. So I could speak about it for hours, and we only have a couple of minutes. But the main point is that there were actions related to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, terrorist actions, in France back to the 70s and 80s. But since then, actually, the form of conflict that we witnessed in France linked to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict was actually not terrorism. So we had violent demonstrations, we had anti-Semitic actions, but no more terrorism. With one important exception, it's the fact that Mohammed Merah, when he targeted the Jewish school, mentioned that he wanted to avenge Palestinian children. So he had been confronted to pro-Palestinian ideology and arguments. But after that, what we saw was actually that the Palestinian issue became much less prominent and much less prevalent in general. And the Syrian conflict actually took the lead. And so the most recent attacks that we've had were clearly linked to Syria, and the issue of Palestine was almost not mentioned at all. But perhaps that Laurence will have a different view because she's following the propaganda on a daily basis, so she may have noticed other elements. With regards to foreign interventions in the Sahel, in the Middle East, etc., I think that it's important to keep in mind that jihadists have their own agency and that it's not counter-terrorism that foster terrorism. Of course, there are strategic dynamics, there are escalation dynamics, but it's not the fact that one country intervenes in another country that produces terrorism. And actually, it's quite, in general, it's quite the contrary. That is to say that if one country decides to intervene in another one, it's because there has already been an attack or a threat. So perhaps I leave it here because otherwise it's going to be really too long.
Do you want to briefly comment on the question of the banlieue and that narrative of
the banlieue,
problems with ghettoization, how that might be driving this up?
Of course. So radicalization, as you know, is a multi-factor issue, and it's very hard to single out, one factor that could lead to radicalization. And we've actually had a pretty hot debate in France among scholars. Those who say that Islamism is the main driver of radicalization, those who say that economic and social issues are the main drivers, those who say that actually foreign interventions are the main drivers. It's especially the case of François Burga, who has a so-called neo-colonial interpretation of radicalization. And we've also had the cult interpretation, the psychological interpretation. So you see almost every scholar had his own or her own interpretation of radicalization. So I'd say that the banlieues, of course, it's part of the picture. And I can also mention one study that I published online. It's called 137 Shades of Terrorism. And it's actually an assessment of 137 profiles of jihadists who were prosecuted in France. And you see that there's an overrepresentation of the banlieues. But there are also approximately half of the sample who did not originate from the banlieue. So it's part of the picture, but it's not the full explanation, of course.
Thank you for that, Marc. And Laurence, I don't know if you have any final words you wanted to touch on or pick up on anything that Marc just talked about.
Yeah, I just wanted to make one or two remarks in complement to what Marc said regarding the Middle East and Palestine, a Palestinian issue in France. So yes, there was MERA 2012, but also Koulibaly with the Hype of Kashem in 2015. The revenge of the Palestinian was one of his narrative, and he expressed it quite clearly. But there are some others. I'm thinking from scratch. I'm thinking about this terror attack in Colombes in 2020 during the lockdown, where the authorities found that the assailant watched a video on Palestine, and that was the driver his driver to violent action. So I think that, of course, the Palestinian issue is very, very important, very significant, very pervasive in the grievances that can feed the will to avenge, that can be a moral shock that will lead to vengeance to many. I would also add, I mean, it's true in theory. Abdullah Azzam, who was a theoretician of jihad, was Palestinian, and he never lost sight of the Palestinian issue. So it's true in theory, and it's also very true in propaganda, because we see very often reference to the Palestinian, which is a very consensual topic. It's a very consensual topic. Recently there was an ICAP video focused on Israel, and during the issues in Israel during last spring, we saw a surge in propaganda in both ISIS, mostly Al-Qaeda actually, but also ISIS, trying to recruit and radicalize around this idea. So it's still very pervasive, I would say, and it's one of the drivers of the turning point from ideology to violent action. And to conclude on the Xray wing, around what we mentioned during this webinar, I would say that the danger in the coming months may be the expansion of this sphere to a broader audience, and this might happen through conspiracy theory, to anti-system narratives, and I would say that what is the most threatening, maybe during the next months, is not the radicalization of the minority, but the radicalization of the majority, or maybe not the majority, but a large, broad movement that can be fueled by this conspiracy theory to various levels that could lead to individual or less individual violent action, be it terrorism or urban violence, and an element that can weaken and that can fragilize democracy.
Well, thank you very much for that, Laurence. I think it's a very apposite remarks for us to end on. And thank you both to Marc and Laurence for giving us a really excellent discussion and set of presentations covering, a pretty wide range of issues that we see in France. And I think we appreciate a huge deal that you're able to take the time to talk us through them in such rich detail, both looking at the threat, but also the response. I've got a couple of housekeeping things I want to briefly end on. First is, we do these webinars at ICPVTR at RSIS, and we really appreciate to hear how they went. And after this, after we end, you'll see a brief QR code flash up to get the feedback form, and we'd hugely appreciate it. Literally 2 seconds it will be for you to do that feedback form. It really helps us make our webinars better for next time round. I also want to briefly mention a project we've been working on, which is the Southeast Asian Militant Atlas. And if you look in the chat function, you'll see a link to it. This is an online resource that we've developed, which is a kind of a mapping project looking at violent Islamist attacks and incidents in Southeast Asia. Going back to 2014, we've got over 1,000 incidents recorded. I think it's about 7 or 8 variables per incident, mapping out across the region. We're adding new instances on a weekly basis and adding new groups on a less than weekly basis because it takes a lot of time to gather the data, but we'd encourage you all to use it. It's an open resource we welcome to everybody to use. Let me briefly end by thanking once again Marc and Laurence for taking the time. I hope that next time we'll be able to do this in person out here in Singapore, and we can welcome you here. And thank you to my wonderful colleagues at RSIS and ICPVTR for organizing it and making this event go so smoothly. So thank you all very much. And I look forward to seeing you at the next webinar, and Laurence and Marc hopefully meeting in person at some point soon. Thank you all very much.
Thank you. Merci.
Thank you very much, Raf.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.